I'm sitting on my couch, sipping a glass of wine and thinking back to where it all began. You know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, looking back now, I can see all the signs clear as day. But at the time, I was completely blind to it all. Let me start from the beginning. I'm Amanda, a 30-year-old physiotherapist. I thought I had it all: a fulfilling career, a beautiful home, and what I believed was a perfect marriage to Brian, my husband of 5 years. He's 32 and works as a real estate agent. We met in college and it was love at first sight. At least, that's what I thought. Our life together seemed like a dream. We'd have breakfast together every morning, sharing our plans for the day. In the evenings, we'd cook dinner and talk about our day. Weekends were for exploring new hiking trails or trying out new restaurants. We were that couple that everyone envied, you know? I remember this one time, about a year ago, when I organized a surprise birthday party for Brian. I invited all his friends and family, decorated our backyard, and even learned to bake his favorite cake from scratch. When he walked in and saw everyone there, the look on his face, God, I can still see it. He hugged me so tight and whispered, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." I felt on top of the world. We had our little traditions too. Every Friday night was date night. We'd take turns planning it. Sometimes it was as simple as a movie night at home. Other times we'd dress up and go dancing. It didn't matter what we did, as long as we were together. I thought we told each other everything. I shared all my hopes and fears with him, and I believed he did the same with me. We talked about our future, about having kids, about growing old together. We even picked out names for our future children. Can you believe that? Looking back, I realize how naive I was. I was so caught up in this perfect image of our life together that I missed all the cracks that were starting to form. But at the time, I was happy, truly, deeply happy. I remember this conversation we had one night, curled up on the couch. Brian looked at me and said, "You know, Amanda, I never believed in soulmates until I met you." I melted. How could I have known that those words would turn to ashes in my mouth just a few months later? But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point in our story, I was still blissfully unaware of what was to come. I was just a woman in love, building a life with the man I thought was my forever. Oh, and there's something else I should mention. About a month before things started to change, I did something that I thought would bring us even closer together. I surprised Brian by adopting a puppy from the local shelter. He was this adorable little golden retriever mix. We named him Max. Brian seemed thrilled at first. He even joked about Max being our practice child. We'd take him for walks in the park, play fetch in the backyard. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. Little did I know, those happy days were numbered. The puppy that I thought would bring us closer together would end up playing a crucial role in exposing the truth. But we'll get to that later. For now, just picture me, Amanda White, physiotherapist, wife, and new puppy mom, thinking I had it all figured out. I was living my happily ever after, or so I thought. I guess it's true what they say. When you're wearing rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look like flags. Looking back, I can see the signs were there, but at the time, I was too caught up in our seemingly perfect life to notice. It started small, you know. Brian began working later hours at the real estate office. At first, I didn't think much of it. The housing market was booming, and he'd always been ambitious. I'd hear him come home late, sometimes after I was already in bed. He'd slip in quietly, trying not to wake me. I'd pretend to be asleep, not wanting to disturb him after a long day. One night, I remember waking up to the sound of the shower running at 2 a.m. I called out, "Brian, everything okay?" His response came quickly, almost too quickly. "Yeah, babe, just had a really long day. Go back to sleep." Something in his voice sounded off, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Then there were the phone calls. He started taking them in another room, his voice low and hushed. Once, I walked in on him mid-conversation, and he abruptly ended the call. "Just work stuff." he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I nodded, ignoring the uneasy feeling in my stomach. Our Friday date nights started to become less frequent. Rain check? He'd say, flashing that charming smile of his. This deal is really important. I'd nod, understanding but disappointed. I started spending more time with Max, our puppy, taking him for long walks in the park. One evening, as I was folding laundry, I found a receipt in Brian's pocket for a fancy restaurant downtown. It was dated for a Tuesday afternoon, a time when he should have been at work. When I casually mentioned it, he barely looked up from his phone. Oh, yeah, lunch with a client. You know how it is. I did know how it was. Or at least I thought I did, but something about his nonchalant response didn't sit right with me. Still, I pushed the thought away. This was Brian, my Brian, the man who had surprised me with breakfast in bed just last month on our anniversary. Then came the night of the charity gala. It was an annual event for local businesses, and we always attended together. This year, though, Brian begged off. I'm swamped with work, babe. You go ahead without me. I went alone, feeling oddly out of place without him by my side. As I was chatting with some friends, I overheard a snippet of conversation. Yeah, I saw Brian at that new bar on 5th last night. He seemed pretty cozy with some redhead. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced a laugh. Must have been someone else, I said. Brian was working late last night, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for Brian to come home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he finally crawled into bed at 1 a.m., I pretended to be asleep, but I noticed the faint smell of unfamiliar perfume clinging to him. The next morning, over breakfast, I casually asked, "How was work last night?" He mumbled something about a difficult client, never meeting my eyes. I watched him over my coffee cup, noticing how he seemed more interested in his phone than our conversation. Max, our puppy, bounded into the kitchen, tail wagging. Brian, who used to dote on him, barely acknowledged him. "Can you take him out?" he asked, already heading for the door. "I'm running late." As I watched him drive away, Max whining at my feet, I felt a heaviness in my chest. These little moments, these small changes, they were adding up to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That day at work, I found myself distracted. My colleague, Sarah, noticed. "Everything okay, Amanda?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Brian's been working late a lot." Sarah gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. "You know," she said slowly, "my ex used to work late a lot too." The implication hung in the air between us, unspoken but unmistakable. I laughed it off, but her words echoed in my mind all day. That evening, as I sat alone on the couch, Max curled up beside me. I found myself staring at Brian's side of the bed, the side that had been empty more often than not lately. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, was there more to these late nights and hushed phone calls than I was letting myself believe? Was I being naive, or was I just being paranoid? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what. You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie, and you're screaming at the character not to go into the dark basement? That's kind of how I feel looking back at this part of my life. The signs were all there, practically screaming at me, but I just couldn't bring myself to face the truth. As the weeks went by, Brian's behavior became more and more suspect. The late nights at work turned into entire weekends spent catching up on paperwork. When he was home, he was distant, always glued to his phone. I'd catch him smiling at text messages, but the moment I'd ask who it was, his face would cloud over. "Just work stuff," he'd mutter, turning away. One night, I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. It was 3 a.m. I padded downstairs, expecting to find him passed out on the couch after a late night. Instead, I found him fully dressed, keys in hand, sneaking out the front door. "Brian!" I called out, my voice thick with sleep and confusion. He jumped like he'd seen a ghost. "Jesus, Amanda, you scared me." "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I, got a call. Emergency with a client. Burst pipe in one of the properties. Even in my groggy state, the lie seemed obvious. Since when did real estate agents handle plumbing emergencies in the middle of the night? But I was too tired. Too scared of the implications to push it further. I just nodded and went back to bed, lying awake until I heard him return 2 hours later. The next morning, over a tense breakfast, I tried to broach the subject. "So, how did the emergency go last night?" He barely looked up from his phone. Oh yeah, all sorted. Must have been some burst pipe to keep you out until 5 a.m. I prodded. His eyes flicked to mine, a flash of, was it guilt? Anger? I couldn't tell. "Look, Amanda, I'm really busy. Can we not do this now?" I felt like I'd been slapped. When did asking my husband about his night become doing this? That day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying all the little moments, all the signs I'd been ignoring. The hushed phone calls, the sudden business trips, the way he'd change the subject whenever I asked about his day. My colleague Sarah noticed my distraction. "Amanda, honey, are you okay? You seem a million miles away." I tried to brush it off, but Sarah wasn't having it. She pulled me aside during lunch break. "Look, I don't want to overstep, but is everything all right with you and Brian?" I felt my eyes well up with tears. I don't know, I admitted. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. Sarah squeezed my hand. "You know, my sister went through something similar with her ex. If you ever need to talk." I nodded, grateful for her support but terrified of what it might mean. That evening, I decided to surprise Brian at his office. I picked up his favorite takeout and headed downtown, but when I arrived, the office was dark and locked. His car wasn't in the parking lot. My heart pounding, I called his cell. It went straight to voicemail. I texted him, trying to keep my tone casual. "Hey, wanted to surprise you with dinner at the office? Where are you?" 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Sorry, in a meeting with a difficult client. Might be late. Don't wait up." I stared at the message, my hands shaking. A meeting? In a locked, dark office? I drove home in a daze, the uneaten takeout cold beside me. When I got home, I found myself standing in front of our bedroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. I saw the dark circles under my eyes, the worry lines that hadn't been there before. When did I start looking so tired? Max came up and nuzzled my hand, whining softly. I knelt down and hugged him tight, burying my face in his fur. "What's happening, Max?" I whispered. "What's happening to us?" That night, as I lay in bed waiting for Brian to come home, I made a decision. I couldn't keep ignoring this. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when clearly it wasn't. I needed answers. As I heard his key in the lock at 1 a.m., I steeled myself. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow, I'd confront him. I'd demand the truth, whatever it might be. Little did I know, the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. You know that saying, the truth will set you free. Well, let me tell you, the journey to that truth can be a real nightmare. Once I decided to stop burying my head in the sand and face reality, things got intense. The morning after I'd made my decision to confront Brian, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. He was already gone, of course. Another early meeting. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, trying to psych myself up for what I knew I had to do. That's when I saw it. Brian's laptop sitting innocently on the counter. He must have forgotten it in his rush to leave. My heart started racing. This was my chance. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the keyboard. Was I really about to do this? Invade my husband's privacy? But then I remembered all the lies, all the late nights, all the hushed phone calls. I took a deep breath and opened it up. Password protected, of course. I tried our anniversary date. Nothing. His birthday? Nope. Then, on a hunch, I tried Max's adoption date. Bingo, I was in. My hands were shaking as I started going through his emails. Most of it was boring work stuff, property listings, client communications, but then I saw it. An email thread with a name I didn't recognize, Jessica. I clicked on it, my heart in my throat. The emails were friendly, too friendly. Lots of inside jokes, plans to meet up. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but enough to make my stomach churn. I was about to close the laptop when I noticed his browser was still open. And there, in his search history, was something that made my blood run cold. How to hide browser history from spouse. That's when I knew this wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't just me being insecure. Something was really, really wrong. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Who was Jessica? What else was Brian hiding? When I got home that evening, I made a decision. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. No more guessing, no more hoping I was wrong. I was going to find out the truth once and for all. I started small. I went through our credit card statements, looking for any unusual charges. Fancy restaurants I didn't remember us going to. Hotel bookings on nights he said he was working late. It was like putting together a puzzle, but every piece I found made me feel sicker. Then I moved on to his phone. He always kept it close, but that night, when he was in the shower, I managed to sneak a look. His messages were clean, too clean. It was like he'd deleted everything. But in his call log, there it was again. Jessica, multiple calls, always late at night or during his supposed work hours. I even stooped so low as to check the pockets of his suits before putting them in the wash. That's when I found it. A receipt for a jewelry store downtown. For a necklace I'd never seen. Each discovery felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know everything. I started keeping a log. Times he said he was working late. Unexplained charges on our credit card. Nights he came home smelling of unfamiliar perfume. It was all there in black and white, the evidence of my crumbling marriage. One night, as I was updating my log, Brian walked in on me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. I slammed my notebook shut, my heart racing. "Nothing," I lied, "just some work stuff." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. Then he shrugged and left the room, but I could feel the tension in the air. He knew something was up. That night, as we lay in bed, miles apart despite being side by side, I made my final decision. I was going to follow him, see for myself where he was really going on these late nights. The next evening, when he said he had to work late, I waited half an hour, then got in my car. I felt like a character in a bad spy movie as I trailed him across town, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it even from his own car. He pulled up to a restaurant I'd never been to, and there, waiting outside, was a woman, tall, slim, with long red hair. As I watched, hidden in my car across the street, Brian greeted her with a kiss. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, a real kiss. The kind of kiss he used to give me. I felt like I was going to be sick. Part of me wanted to storm over there to confront them both. But another part, the part that was still in denial, held me back. I needed more proof, I told myself. I needed to be sure. So I sat there, watching as they enjoyed a romantic dinner, laughing and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. Like there wasn't a woman across the street, her world falling apart as she watched. When I finally drove home, hours later, I felt hollow, empty, but also strangely determined. Now I knew. Now I had seen it with my own eyes. And now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. You know how they say ignorance is bliss? Well, let me tell you, knowledge isn't all it's cracked up to be either. After seeing Brian with that woman, I was a mess. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, laughing, kissing. It was torture, but I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I needed more evidence, more certainty. Maybe I was just being paranoid, right? Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for all of this. God, I wanted to believe that so badly, so I kept digging. I became a regular Sherlock Holmes, minus the cool hat and pipe. I started checking the mileage on his car, comparing it to the distances he should have been driving for work. The numbers didn't add up. He was going somewhere else, somewhere far. Then there was the time I accidentally knocked over his briefcase. Papers went everywhere, and as I was helping him pick them up, I noticed a receipt. It was for a hotel, dated for a day he told me he was on a business trip 2 towns over, but the hotel, it was right here in our city. I confronted him about it, my heart pounding. "Oh, that," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah." The client meeting got moved at the last minute. "Didn't I tell you?" I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand the truth. But I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. One day, while he was in the shower, I checked his phone again. This time, I hit the jackpot, a text from Jessica. "Can't wait to see you tonight, babe. Same place." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Babe, babe. That was my nickname for him. Well, it used to be anyway, before all of this started. But then, just as I was about to confront him with this damning evidence, doubt crept in again. What if it wasn't what I thought? What if Jessica was just a really close friend? A colleague, maybe? I mean, some people use a babewom for everyone, right? I know. I was grasping at straws. But can you blame me? I'd built my whole life around this man. The thought of it all being a lie, it was too much to bear. So, I decided to give him one last chance, one last opportunity to come clean on his own. I planned a romantic dinner at home, his favorite meal, candles, the works. I even bought a new dress, did my hair up nice, just like old times. When he got home, he seemed surprised. "What's all this?" he asked, looking around warily. "Just thought we could use a nice night in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's been a while since we've had some quality time together." He nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We sat down to eat, and I tried to keep the conversation light, asked about his day, told him about mine. It was like talking to a stranger. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached across the table, took his hand in mine. "Brian," I said softly, "is there anything you want to tell me? Anything at all?" For a moment, just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, regret. I held my breath, waiting, hoping, but then it was gone. He squeezed my hand, gave me that charming smile that used to make my knees weak. "No, babe," he said. "Everything's fine. Why do you ask?" I felt my heart sink. Even now, even given the perfect opportunity, he was still lying to my face. I forced a smile, shook my head. No reason. I lied right back. "Just checking in?" The rest of the evening was a blur. We cleaned up, watched some TV, went to bed. All the while, my mind was racing. What was I supposed to do now? The next morning, I woke up early. Brian was still asleep, snoring softly beside me. I looked at him, really looked at him. This man I'd loved for so long. This man I thought I knew better than anyone. How could he do this to me? I got up quietly, went downstairs. Max was there, wagging his tail, excited for his morning walk. As I clipped on his leash, I made a decision. No more detective work, no more giving the benefit of the doubt. It was time to face the truth, whatever it might be. I took Max for a long walk, letting the crisp morning air clear my head. By the time I got back, I knew what I had to do. I was going to confront Brian, once and for all. No more games, no more lies. But as I walked into the house, ready to demand answers, I stopped short. There, on the kitchen counter was a note. "Got called into work early, might be late tonight, don't wait up. B." I crumpled the note in my fist, feeling a surge of anger. Even now, even after everything, he was still lying, still sneaking around. Well, two could play at that game. If he wasn't going to give me answers, I was going to find them myself, once and for all. I grabbed my keys, my determination overriding my fear. It was time to pay a visit to Brian's office, time to see for myself what exactly he was hiding. Little did I know, what I was about to discover would change everything. You know that feeling when you're on a roller coaster and you're clicking up to the top of that first big drop, that mixture of excitement and terror. That's exactly how I felt as I drove to Brian's office. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but I was determined. No more guessing, no more doubts. I was going to get answers. I parked across the street from his office building, my heart pounding. I'd been here dozens of times before for office parties, picking him up for dates, but this time felt different. This time, I felt like an intruder. I waited for about an hour, watching the entrance. No sign of Brian. Just as I was about to give up and go home, I saw her, the redhead from the restaurant. Jessica. She walked into the building like she owned the place, all confidence and swaying hips. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. But finally, I was in. Brian's office looked normal at first glance. Neat desk, family photos, including one of me and Max that made my heart ache, client files stacked neatly, but something felt off. I started opening drawers, rifling through papers, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw it, a small black notebook hidden under a stack of contracts. I opened it, and my world tilted on its axis. Inside were detailed notes about meetings with Jessica, dates, times, places, some of them going back months. My stomach churned as I read entry after entry. Met Jay for lunch, discussed expansion plans. Dinner with Jay, she loves the new necklace. Weekend getaway with Jay, told A working on big deal. A, that was me. I was A, just an initial, an afterthought in his secret life. I was so engrossed in the notebook that I didn't hear the door open. Didn't notice I wasn't alone until I heard his voice. Amanda, what are you doing here? I spun around, the notebook clutched to my chest. Brian stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of shock and... was that fear? I think the better question is, what are you doing, Brian? My voice was surprisingly steady. Or should I ask, what are you doing with Jessica? His face went pale. Amanda, I can explain. But I was done with explanations, done with lies. I held up the notebook. Really? Can you explain this? All these secret meetings, all these lies? He took a step towards me, hands outstretched. It's not what you think. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Oh, really? Because I think you've been cheating on me for months. I think you've been lying to my face every single day. Am I wrong, Brian? He didn't answer. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. I felt something break inside me. All the love, all the trust, all the years we'd spent together, it all came crashing down in that moment. How could you do this to me? I whispered, tears finally spilling over. To us? He ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. I don't know. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to laugh. Never meant to hurt me. What did he think all these lies would do? Just then, the door opened again, and there she was. Jessica. She stopped short when she saw me, her eyes darting between Brian and me. Oh, she said softly. Oh no. I looked at her, this woman who'd been sharing my husband. She was beautiful, yes. But she looked just as shocked and scared as Brian did. You must be Jessica, I said, my voice cold. Nice to finally meet you. I'm Amanda, Brian's wife. Her face crumpled. Wife? But he told me you were separated. I turned to Brian, fury rising in me. Separated? Is that what you've been telling her? Brian looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. I can explain. But I was done listening, done with all of it. I shoved the notebook into his chest. Keep it, I spat. You two deserve each other. I turned to leave, but then stopped. Looked back at them both. You know what the worst part is? It's not even the cheating. It's the lies, the sneaking around. You made me doubt myself. I doubt my own sanity. And for what? So you could have your cake and eat it too. Brian started to say something, but I held up a hand. Save it. I don't want to hear any more lies. I walked out of that office with my head held high, even as tears streamed down my face. As I got in my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, heartbreak, definitely, but also relief. The truth was out. No more wondering, no more doubting. As I drove home, I realized something. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of my new life. A life without lies, without betrayal, a life where I put myself first. I didn't know what that life would look like yet, but I knew one thing for sure. It would be better than the lie I'd been living. When I got home, Max greeted me at the door, tail wagging. I knelt down, hugged him tight. "It's just you and me now, buddy," I whispered. And you know what? For the first time in a long time, I felt like that might be enough. You know that moment in movies where the hero finds the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that changes everything? Well, life isn't always like the movies. Sometimes the evidence is a lot messier, a lot more complicated, and sometimes it just keeps piling up until you can't ignore it anymore. After the confrontation at Brian's office, I was a wreck. I spent the next few days in a daze, alternating between crying my eyes out and feeling numb. Max was my constant companion, always by my side, offering silent support. I don't know what I would have done without him, but as the initial shock wore off, something else started to take its place. Anger, and with that anger came determination. I wasn't going to let Brian get away with this. I wasn't going to let him make me feel like I was crazy for suspecting something was wrong. So I went back to my investigation, this time with renewed vigor. I wasn't looking for proof of his affair anymore. I had that. Now I was looking for everything else he might be hiding. I started with our finances. I pored over bank statements, credit card bills, everything I could get my hands on. And let me tell you, what I found made my blood boil. There were charges for hotels I'd never heard of, restaurants we'd never been to together. But that wasn't the worst of it. No. The worst was when I found transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Large transfers, money that should have been going towards our future, our dreams, was instead funding his secret life. I confronted Brian about it one night when he came home late, again. "Care to explain these?" I asked, shoving the bank statements in his face. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Amanda, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," I spat. "You seem to have an explanation for everything these days. So go ahead. Explain how you've been siphoning off our savings for months." He stammered, tried to come up with some excuse about investments, about surprises he was planning, but I wasn't buying it anymore. "Save it, Brian," I said, cutting him off. "I'm done with your lies." But I wasn't done investigating. Oh no, I was just getting started. I dug deeper into his work life, called some of his colleagues under the guise of planning a surprise party. What I learned made my stomach churn. Turns out, Brian hadn't been working late at all. In fact, he'd been slacking off, missing meetings, dropping the ball on important deals. One of his coworkers, thinking she was helping plan a celebration, let slip something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, you must be so excited about the promotion," she gushed. "Promotion? What promotion?" Brian hadn't mentioned any promotion to me. I pressed for more details, and what I learned made me see red. Brian had been offered a significant promotion months ago, a promotion that would have meant more money, more security for our future. But he'd turned it down. Why? Because it would have meant moving to another city, away from Jessica. He'd chosen his affair over our future, over me. That night, when Brian came home, I was waiting for him. The lights were off, just a single lamp illuminating the living room. I must have looked like something out of a noir film, sitting there in the shadows. "We need to talk," I said as he walked in. He froze, like a guilty kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Amanda, what's going on? I stood up slowly, walked towards him. I know about the promotion, Brian, the one you turned down. His face went pale. How did you? That doesn't matter. I cut him off. What matters is that you made a choice. You chose her over me, over us. He tried to deny it, to come up with some excuse, but I wasn't having it. I laid out everything I'd discovered. The financial deceptions, the lies at work, all of it. As I talked, I saw something in his eyes change. The fear, the guilt, it all melted away. And what was left, it scared me. It was cold, calculating, like he was finally dropping the act. You want to know the truth? Amanda, he said, his voice hard. The truth is, I've been unhappy for a long time. Jessica, she understands me in a way you never have. His words hit me like a physical blow. All the air left my lungs. How can you say that? I whispered. After everything we've been through together. He shrugged, and in that moment, I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me. It is what it is, he said. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but maybe it's for the best. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, was dismantling our entire life together like it meant nothing. Get out, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Get out of this house right now. He looked surprised for a moment, then nodded. I'll get my things in the morning, he said, turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, my legs no longer able to support me. Max came over, whining softly, and curled up next to me. I buried my face in his fur and let the tears come. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the future I'd planned, for the love I thought was real. But most of all, I cried for the woman I used to be, the trusting, naive woman who had believed in happily ever afters. That woman was gone now. And in her place? Well, I wasn't sure yet. But I knew one thing. Whoever I was becoming, she was stronger. She was smarter, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small ever again. As I sat there on the floor, Max by my side, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And this time, I was going to be the author of my own happiness. You know how in movies, when the hero finally confronts the villain, there's this big dramatic showdown. Well, let me tell you, real life isn't always that neat. Sometimes, the confrontation is messy, painful, and leaves you feeling hollow inside. That's exactly how I felt when I finally decided to confront Brian with all the evidence I'd gathered. I spent days preparing for this moment. I gathered all the financial records, the phone logs, even printed out some of the text messages I'd found. I laid it all out on our dining room table, a damning display of his betrayal. When Brian came home that evening, I was waiting. We need to talk, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked at me, then at the papers spread across the table. I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes before he masked it with indifference. What's all this? He asked, trying to sound casual. I took a deep breath. This, Brian, is the evidence of your affair, of your lies, of everything you've been hiding from me. He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. No, you've done enough talking. Now it's my turn. I started going through the evidence piece by piece, the hotel receipts, the mysterious bank transfers, the text messages. With each new revelation, I saw Brian's facade crumble a little more. How could you do this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How could you throw away our entire life together? For a moment, Brian looked genuinely remorseful. Amanda, I never meant for this to happen. It just did. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. It just happened for months. You accidentally fell into bed with another woman over and over again. He flinched at my words. It's not like that. Jessica and I, we have a connection. Something I haven't felt in a long time. His words cut deep, but I refused to let him see how much they hurt. A connection, I repeated. And what about our connection, Brian? What about the vows we made? He had the decency to look ashamed. I know I've hurt you, Amanda. I'm sorry for that, but maybe this is for the best. We've been growing apart for a while now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Growing apart? Is that how you justify this? By rewriting our entire history? I picked up one of the bank statements. And what about this? The money you've been funneling away, was that growing apart too? Brian's face hardened. And that's none of your business. None of my business, I was shouting now, all pretense of calm forgotten. It's our money, Brian, money we were saving for our future. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. A future that clearly isn't going to happen now, is it? His words hung in the air between us, heavy with finality. I felt something inside me break. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Get out of this house right now. Brian looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He turned and walked out of the room. I heard him moving around upstairs, packing a bag. When he came back down, he paused in the doorway. I am sorry, Amanda, he said softly. For what it's worth, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't look at him. Just go, I whispered. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the empty house. And just like that, my marriage was over. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the evidence of my shattered life spread out on the table. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Max eventually came and nudged my hand with his nose, whining softly. I looked down at him, his big brown eyes full of concern, and something inside me crumbled. I slid to the floor and buried my face in his fur, finally letting the tears come. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the future I'd planned, for the love I thought was real, but most of all, I cried for the woman I used to be. The trusting, naive woman who had believed in happily ever afters. As the tears finally subsided, I felt empty, like I'd cried out every last emotion, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. But in that emptiness, I felt something else stirring, something that felt a lot like determination. I stood up slowly, wiping my eyes. I looked around our home. No, my home now. The home that Brian and Jessica had probably laughed about behind my back. The home where I'd been made a fool of for months. In that moment, I made a decision. This wasn't going to break me. This betrayal, this pain, it was going to make me stronger. I wasn't going to let Brian and his lies define me. I was going to redefine myself. I walked over to the table and started gathering up all the evidence. I didn't need it anymore. I had my proof, I had my closure. Now it was time to move forward. As I was putting everything away, my hand brushed against something in my pocket. It was the business card of a lawyer friend had given me, just in case. I'd kept it, hoping I'd never need it. Now I looked at it with new eyes. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. It was late, but I knew she'd understand. As the phone rang, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Hello? Came the sleepy voice on the other end. Hi, it's Amanda, I said, my voice steady. I need your help. I'm getting a divorce. As I said those words out loud for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but alongside it was something else, something that felt a lot like hope. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life would go, but maybe, just maybe, it could still be something beautiful, something strong, something entirely my own. You know how they say it's always darkest before the dawn? Well, let me tell you, the days and weeks after Brian left were the darkest I'd ever experienced. It was like I'd fallen into a deep, dark pit, and I couldn't see any way out. At first, I just went through the motions. I'd get up, feed Max, go to work, come home, feed Max again, go to bed, rinse and repeat. I was like a robot, just going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. My colleagues at the physiotherapy clinic noticed the change in me. "Amanda, are you okay?" Sarah asked one day, her voice filled with concern. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that my entire world had fallen apart? Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my marriage in my head. Where did it all go wrong? Was there something I could have done differently? The questions swirled in my mind, keeping me from sleep. One night, about 2 weeks after Brian left, I found myself standing in my closet, staring at his clothes. They still hung there, a reminder of the life we'd shared. In a fit of anger and grief, I started yanking them off the hangers, throwing them on the floor. I was sobbing, screaming, letting out all the pain I'd been holding in. Max came running. Barking at the commotion, he nuzzled against my leg, whining softly. His presence brought me back to reality. I sank to the floor, surrounded by Brian's discarded clothes, and hugged Max tightly. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "We're going to be okay." But the truth was, I didn't feel okay. I felt lost, adrift in a world that suddenly made no sense. The future I'd planned, the life I'd envisioned, it was all gone. And I had no idea how to move forward. I started having trouble at work. My hands would shake during treatments, my mind wandering to thoughts of Brian and Jessica. One day, I nearly dropped a weight on a patient's foot. My boss called me into his office after that. "Amanda," he said gently, "I think you need to take some time off, sort things out." I wanted to argue, to insist I was fine, but the truth was, I wasn't. I nodded silently and left the office, feeling like a failure. Not only had my personal life fallen apart, but now my professional life was suffering too. The days stretched out endlessly before me. I'd wake up late, spend hours on the couch watching mindless TV, barely eating. Max would bring me his leash, eager for walks, but most days I couldn't muster the energy to take him further than around the block. My friends tried to help. They'd come over with food, try to get me to go out, but I pushed them away. I couldn't bear their pity, their well-meaning but empty reassurances that everything would be okay. One day, about a month after Brian left, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through social media when I saw it. A picture of Brian and Jessica, smiling, happy. The caption read, "New beginnings." Something inside me snapped. I threw my phone across the room, hearing it crack against the wall. I screamed, I cried, I raged, all the pain. All the anger I'd been holding in came pouring out. I don't know how long I sat there sobbing, but eventually, I became aware of a wet nose pressing against my hand. "Max," he whined softly, his big brown eyes full of concern. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in weeks. His coat was dull, his eyes sad. I realized with a pang of guilt that in my grief, I'd been neglecting him too. "Oh, Max," I whispered, pulling him close. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I've been a terrible mom, haven't I?" As I held him, something shifted inside me. I'd been so caught up in my own pain, my own loss, that I'd forgotten I wasn't alone. I still had Max. I still had my friends, my family. I still had myself. That night, for the first time in weeks, I took a long shower. I put on clean clothes. I cooked a real meal. Small steps, but they felt monumental. The next day, I called my boss and asked if I could come back to work. He sounded relieved. "We've missed you, Amanda," he said warmly. I also called my lawyer. It was time to start the divorce proceedings. The thought still made my stomach churn, but I knew it was necessary. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My eyes were still puffy from crying, my face pale. But there was something else there too, a glimmer of determination. I wasn't okay, not yet. The pain was still there, raw and aching. But for the first time since Brian left, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. I looked at Max, who was watching me with those soulful eyes of his. "What do you say, buddy?" I asked. "Ready for a fresh start?" He wagged his tail, and I felt myself smile. It was small, and it felt foreign on my face after so many weeks of sadness. But it was there. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And this time, I was going to write it on my own terms. As I headed out for a walk with Max, the sun peeking through the clouds for the first time in what felt like forever, I made a promise to myself. I was going to get through this. I was going to come out stronger on the other side. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more dark days ahead, I was sure. But I wasn't going to let this break me. I was Amanda White, and I was a survivor. You know how they say rock bottom is a solid foundation? Well, let me tell you, it's true. Once I hit my lowest point, the only way to go was up. And that's exactly what I did. It didn't happen overnight, of course. Healing takes time. And there were still days when I felt like I couldn't get out of bed. But slowly, surely, I started to rebuild my life. The first big step was finalizing the divorce. It was painful, seeing Brian across the table, flanked by his lawyer. But I held my head high. I refused to let him see how much he'd hurt me. When it was all over, when I signed those final papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was done. I was free. Next, I threw myself into my work. I'd always loved being a physiotherapist, helping people recover and regain their strength. Now, I channeled all my energy into it. I took extra courses, learned new techniques. My boss noticed the change. "Amanda," he said one day, I'm impressed. You've really stepped up your game." I smiled, feeling a warmth of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks," I said. "I'm just trying to be the best I can be." But it wasn't just about work. I started taking care of myself too. I joined a gym, started eating healthier. I even took up yoga, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the courage to. It was hard at first, my body stiff and uncooperative. But with each session, I felt stronger, more flexible, both physically and emotionally. One day, as I was leaving the yoga studio, I bumped into Sarah from work. Her eyes widened as she took me in. "Amanda, you look amazing." I felt myself blush. "Thanks," I said. "I've been working on myself." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then said, "Listen, a bunch of us from work are going out for drinks tonight. Want to join?" My first instinct was to say no. I'd been avoiding social situations, still feeling raw and vulnerable. But something made me pause. Maybe it was time to start living again. "You know what?" I said. "I'd love to." That night out was a turning point. For the first time in months, I laughed. Really laughed. It felt good, like I was waking up from a long sleep. As I was walking home that night, feeling lighter than I had in ages, I passed by a community center. A poster caught my eye. "Share your story. Support group for survivors of infidelity." I stood there for a long moment, staring at that poster. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I took down the details. The next week, I found myself sitting in a circle of strangers, all of us bound by the same painful experience. At first, I just listened, but then, slowly, I started to share my story, and as I talked, as I let out all the pain and anger I'd been holding inside, I felt something shift. These people understood. They didn't judge me for still feeling hurt, for still having days when I couldn't get out of bed. They just listened and supported and shared their own stories of survival. As the weeks went by, I found myself looking forward to these meetings, not just for the support, but because I realized I had something to offer too. My story, my journey, could help others who were still in the depths of their pain. One night, after a particularly powerful meeting, one of the group members approached me. "Amanda," she said, "have you ever thought about turning your experience into something more, like, I don't know, a blog or something?" I laughed it off at first. Me? A blogger? But the idea stuck with me. When I got home that night, I sat down at my computer and started typing. I poured out my story, all the raw, messy details of it, and when I was done, I hit publish before I could second guess myself. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from women and men who had been through similar experiences. They thanked me for my honesty, for giving voice to their pain. They shared their own stories of betrayal and recovery. Before I knew it, my little blog had turned into a community, a safe space for people to share, to heal, to support each other. I started getting invitations to speak at events, to share my story with larger audiences. It wasn't always easy. Reliving my pain, sharing it with the world, it took its toll. But every time I received a message from someone saying I'd helped them, that my story had given them hope, it made it all worth it. One day, about a year after I'd started my blog, I received an email that made me pause. It was from a publisher. They wanted to turn my blog into a book. I sat there, staring at my screen, hardly able to believe it. Meet an author? It seemed impossible. But then I thought about all the people I'd connected with, all the stories I'd heard. Maybe this was my chance to reach even more people, to spread a message of hope and resilience. As I sat there, contemplating this new opportunity, Max came up and put his head on my lap. I scratched behind his ears, smiling down at him. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked. "Should we do it?" He wagged his tail, and I laughed. "Yeah, I think so too." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far I'd come. From the broken woman crying on her closet floor to this, a successful physiotherapist, a blogger, and now, potentially, an author. It hadn't been an easy journey, but I was proud of how far I'd come. I thought about Brian, about Jessica. I realized with a start that I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about them. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it no longer consumed me. They were a part of my past, but they didn't define my future. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was Amanda White, survivor, fighter, and now storyteller. And my story was far from over.